The thing that stands between us and the Japanese is not great geographic distance, but the fact that we don't share a common history. America is linked to Europe by a Judeo-Christian tradition that really goes back to the golden age of Greece. We've only known about Japan for the last century or so. So when the Japanese do things differently from the way we do, we call them exotic or strange. When they do things our way, we call them copiers. The fact is, the Japanese are a lot more than just adapters. They're skilled innovators. What they've done is to create their own version of the 20th century. The reason they're able to absorb Western influence so well is that they've never lost their own roots. They know exactly who they are. They're always Japanese. In psychological terms, they find their identity in the group far more than we do. It's easier to show all this than talk about it. We're using the puppet theater as a symbol to show how the Japanese mind works. They don't believe much in improvisation. They believe success is a result of careful group work rather than personal inspiration. It takes 10 years to learn how to manipulate the left hand of a bunraku-da. Another 10 years of training before the puppeteer takes over the head and body. Each puppeteer must know exactly what the other is going to do. Otherwise, the doll would move awkwardly. Backstage, this becomes a kind of ballet. The Japanese feel most secure while working in a group. There's something specifically Japanese in all this. For if the project falters, the blame falls not on the individual, but on the group as a whole. To be personally blamed for something is about the worst thing that can happen. More than any people I know, the Japanese are culturally conditioned to work together. They're always at their best when they're working with other people. The judgment of the group takes the place of the conscience of the individual. Religion. Americans always assume that Orientals are more mystic and spiritual than we are. That's not true for the Japanese. A second mistake we make is to read our concepts into their religions. For us, religion puts morality into our daily lives. For the Japanese, even these Japanese entertainers who've come to a temple between shows, religion is something more casual. It may be comforting, it may be refreshing, even fun, but it doesn't affect their daily lives. Japanese morals come from someplace else than heaven. The point of going to a temple is just to establish a momentary communion with a superior being. The Japanese attitude to their gods is respectful, brief, and practical. Some still believe that rubbing smoke from incense on their bodies helps cure ailments. Neither morality nor political philosophy derives from religion. What does come from it is sociability and emotional release. One way the Japanese get involved in religion is during the hundreds of small local festivals. These Shinto festivals don't have much religious content from our point of view. It may look fanatical, but all that's happening is that the boys are having a good time. Again, the Japanese are letting themselves go in a group in a way they would never let themselves go as individuals. The fact that Japanese religions have little to do with morality is something difficult for us to understand. What keeps the Japanese society in check if there are no commandments and morality doesn't derive from God? What keeps these people in check is not the sense of guilt before God, but shame before their fellow men. A parent disciplines a child not by saying this is wrong, but by saying people will laugh at you. Sin is not the same for them as it is for us. The greatest sin in Japan is to violate the social codes. Unlike America, the family doesn't protect the child from the scorn of society. It blames the child for having brought shame on the family. It praises the child for having brought honor to the family. Thus, the Japanese arrive at virtue by a different road than we do, but they do arrive there. Japan has less crime than any major nation of the Western world. This conformism can take place only if society is stable. The Japanese have had hundreds of years to work out their rules of social conduct. For over 1,000 years, there's been almost no immigration. The average Japanese goes through life without ever meeting anyone else but other Japanese. In sum, these are an isolated people who see everyone else in Japan as a member of the same big family. The Japanese have lived together under crowded conditions for a very long time, and so they've developed extremely precise rules for dealing with each other. It's a whole encyclopedia of manners and forms of politeness, covering every possible situation, no matter how complicated or unpleasant. The rules are much more complex and rigid than anything we're used to. That's why Japanese traveling in the Western world is likely to feel a little uncomfortable, as if he'd wandered into a barbecue wearing a full-dress suit. One thing you can be sure of, between Japanese and Japanese, there's always a bow. The bow is the exterior sign of their rigid social code. Now, when a miniskirt, a kimono, a student, and an executive meet, there seems to be a lot of aimless bobbing up and down. Or when you see a pretty girl bowing to a red telephone, you begin to wonder what it all means. But there's some very precise rules to bowing. As I've been saying, Japan is a country where nothing between people is left to chance. There are rules underlying all social behavior. For the anatomy of bowing, let's watch these two businessmen greeting each other. The man on the right gets down first and lowest. He's adopted what the Japanese call low posture. He's being overly modest. This forces the man on the left to try to take an even lower posture. Because the situation is uncomfortable, the bowing starts again. The man on the right relents and lets his companion go lower. They're each watching the other. That's why they don't bow head on. One must never be caught upright while the other is on the way down. The conversation is really unimportant. The bow gives an exact measure of social distance between people. The worst thing that any Japanese can say about another is that he behaved unpredictably. If you stick to prescribed form, you can't make a mistake. Into this land which swears by formality and homogeneity came we Americans, who swear by informality and individualism. The result of all this swearing is cultural shock.
That she will call me Mama.
On a more serious level, English, mostly American style, is Japan's second language. Most Japanese study our language in school for 6 years. I wish I could report that the level of English is high. It isn't. But what is at a high level is the intensity with which the Japanese struggle with the problems they have to solve. Watch this scene. Not for the English, but for the concentration of effort.
But she couldn't do that. Why? Why?
Because her father.
No, her mother.
Because her mother is
Japan's motto ought to be, we try harder.
sick
No.
before.
When she got better, she would hear Eleanor read every day. Why?
Because she's
When all this beautiful intensity gets unleashed, you can see deeply into the heart of the Japanese character. The camera has not been tricked. This is the normal speed and intensity at which Munakata, a famous woodblock artist, works. We Americans used to confuse this intensity with fanaticism, particularly when the end product was foreign to our tastes. But in things that are familiar to us, for example, the struggle to enter a top university, the same intensity is again visible. These anxious young men are awaiting the results of the competitive examination for entrance into Tokyo University, the most prestigious university in Japan. This is an especially tense moment in Japanese life. When the lists are posted, the numbers tell more than which students will be accepted. They indicate which young men will be the future leaders of Japan. Up until a century ago, the Japanese had a feudal society in which birth determined a man's place. But since then, Japan has become a country in which success is based almost entirely on education. Acceptance in the right university has become so important, it's one of the few times the Japanese break all rules of conduct and permit themselves public joy or grief. Students who are not accepted will on occasion commit suicide. Others will try again and again at the same university and won't settle for a lesser college. This doesn't mean docility once they're accepted. Dissent plays as large a part in Japanese life as it does in ours. Students demonstrate in Japan for much the same reason they riot in America, in protest against Vietnam, middle-class values, and outdated university systems. The Japanese student has been at it longer than his American counterpart. Serious rioting began about 10 years ago, when the Japanese-American Security Pact was being ratified. It is widespread again now and can be expected to grow worse next year, when the treaty is up for review. The helmets make these protests look a lot fiercer than what we're accustomed to. The fact is that in 10 years of serious rioting, only 3 people have been killed, all of them by accident. The Japanese bring the same serious professionalism to disorder as they do to all their other activities. After months of violence, students of Tokyo University occupied one of the administrative buildings. As one watches the fracas, some of the social themes we've been talking about are illustrated. Organization and restraint are evident on both sides. The police are armed defensively. Their weapons shoot only water. The police tactic in this strike was to wash the students away. That's water being dropped from the helicopter. The more closely one looks, the more evident it becomes that this is a masterpiece of organization and restraint. Police power and student power are not meeting each other with raw force. I should say that by the time the students started using Molotov cocktails, the only students left were the extreme elements of the Zengakuren, a group so far out that the communists are, by comparison, conservatives. Escalation to Molotov cocktails finally brought out police tear gas. The end was predictable. Everyone knew that the students would be dislodged from the building. But the point is that they had to be allowed to lose with dignity. That's a very Japanese theme, and the reason for this whole sequence. You must always avoid disgracing your opponent. So, between the white flag of surrender and the moment before the police arrest the rioters, there's time allowed for the demonstrators to sing the Internationale. This showy, splashy demonstration is the sort of thing that substitutes for news from Japan. We fail to notice how ceremonious and professional the riot really is. Each side allows the other to maintain its self-respect. The same rule is supposed to apply to politics. The Japanese character in many ways is well suited to democracy. Japan started developing a parliamentary democracy 80 years ago and has moved steadily in this direction, except during the 1930s, when the military captured the government. This single disastrous slip led to a defeat in war as severe as any nation has ever suffered. Since then, they've renounced militarism and re-embraced democracy with a passion we might well envy. Their system has a typically Japanese flavor. They believe the views of the minority should be respected. The ruling party is supposed to take into account the demands of their opponents. Consensus is what they're after, not just simple majority rule. Grassroots politics are much the same in Japan as in the United States. Their politicians go through the same rituals as ours. The country is ruled by a conservative coalition which has held power for 20 years. There's a good reason for this conservative rule. Japan has been doubling its income every 5 or 6 years. With that kind of success, the conservatives are likely to go on winning elections for some time to come. The basic idea of the conservatives is the same as Calvin Coolidge. The business of government is business. They view almost all their problems as solvable by economic means. Such materialism may not seem very oriental to us, but since they spend relatively little on military arms, they've been winning one economic victory after another. What the Japanese have done is to take a land poor in natural resources, but with a highly educated, hard-working population, and make fine quality, low-priced products. We tend to dismiss the Japanese success in electronics as little men making little things. But in shipbuilding, the Japanese have taught the whole world a lesson. The Japanese captured the tanker market by outstudying the European shipyards. The British were putting in 3 hours of paperwork for each hour of actual shipbuilding. The Japanese went to 9 hours of computerized detailed study and cut down on the cost of assembling. The result is that the market is theirs. They're building the biggest and most efficient cargo ships in the world. Of course, shipbuilding fits the island tradition of Japan. Like the British, they live or die by ocean routes. Yet the Japanese have succeeded in many fields that are new to them. Japan has become the world's leading maker and exporter of pianos. This for a nation that hadn't heard Western music a century ago. The idea of success by working in groups extends all the way down through kindergarten. The mass teaching of young violinists by Shinichi Suzuki has become a breakthrough in musical training. A Suzuki group of children between 5 and 7 years old, though they start as young as 3. The point is that if a child can learn the sounds of his own language by 3, he can learn music at the same age. The method of training is so successful that many major American music schools have copied it. There's something that makes Westerners vaguely uneasy about hearing Bach played by Orientals. I mean, Bach is so American, he ought to belong to us alone. More seriously, there's a great shortage of string players in major American orchestras. We've already begun to import Japanese violinists for our symphonies. Perhaps someday one of these young Suzuki-trained musicians will be a concertmaster. We'll know where to go if America ever needs a left-handed fiddler who learned to bow early and who has an itch here or there. The lesson Japan offers the world is that to be successful, to be modern, a nation doesn't have to be Western. Every nation can make its own version of a modern society. It also ought to comfort us to know that there are 100 million Japanese, twice the size of France, whose social goals are closely parallel to ours. The most powerful nation in Asia is linked to us not as a follower or an imitator, but as a partner and an equal. I said to begin this broadcast, what happens between us and the Japanese is far more important than what happens between us and the Chinese or the Vietnamese. The Japanese admit they've learned much from us. Perhaps it's time that we studied them a lot more carefully. They've faced the problems of crowding and overpopulation without losing their sense of human values. It stands to reason that we may have something to learn here. And when the rest of Asia moves into the 20th century, the countries of the East may turn more naturally to the Japanese than to us. In the history of nations, there sometimes occurs a stage which later generations look back to as a golden age. It's a time when a nation exerts an influence on its neighbors and on the future far out of proportion to its actual size or wealth. Japan may be entering such a golden age right now. I'm Edwin Reischauer. Good night.
CBS News has presented The Japanese with Edwin Reischauer.